Well, I want to welcome everybody tonight. I'm Dr. Jim Ladley, president of Profit Pro Ag, and we're coming to you from Alberta, Minnesota, which is our headquarters. We're going to have a very timely topic tonight, I think, something that you're all going to enjoy talking about. And I'll go through a series of PowerPoint slides as we go through the program tonight. We also will have Dennis Clockegay that will join us. Maybe we'll have make some input as we go through the program also. Dennis is our lead crop management consultant out of Sauk Center, Minnesota, and he operates across the U.S. and mainly the upper Midwest. The information that we're going to cover tonight is on our website, profitproag.com, and you can go there and get the information. Some of you maybe were emailed a newsletter that we put out prior to the webinar that contains all the content that I'm going to go over tonight. So you can look at that. You can ask questions at any time, log on, and there's a way for you to post questions. At the end of the program, we'll ask John, who's running the program for us, if we have any questions at that time, and we'll answer them. So what I'm going to do right now is really start. So what we're going to talk about tonight is carbon, the limiting factor. And to some of you, this may be kind of an interesting subject when we talk about carbon and crop production being a limiting factor. The fact that CO2 is a limited nutrient in crop production, and I hope by the end of the evening I can point that out to you, why it is. But the fact is, carbon makes up 45% of the plant mass above and below ground. Think about that. 45% of the plant is made out of carbon, and that's why we talk about it being the limiting factor. When we look at this in perspective, as you see on this chart right here, the top four elements I have right here, oxygen 45%. Those four elements make up 97.5% of the weight of a plant. When we add in magnesium, potassium, calcium, and phosphorus, that takes us to 99.5% of the plant mass is made out of those elements. We call those the structural elements, the macronutrients. But the fact is, carbon, as you can see right here, now when you look at this chart right here, you'll see that we measure the weight of these elements by atomic weight. And hydrogen is 1, carbon is 12, nitrogen is 14, and oxygen is 16. So in relationship to all the other elements that come into the plant, these are low weight elements. What really puts mass and test weight into grains and forages are, the other elements that we have on the chart, plus all the trace elements. For example, moly, which is a trace element, has an atomic weight of 95. And so really what puts test weight into grain are the trace elements and taste and flavor as we look at it. But we want to focus on the fact that carbon makes up 45% of the weight of the plant. Now, any required material which is in short supply or improper condition that prevents metabolic processes from occurring as rapidly as it could is called a limiting factor. So can carbon become a limiting factor? That's really the question that we want to talk about. In the case of photosynthesis, inadequate light in the morning or evening or on a cloudy day can be a limiting factor. Cold temperatures and lack of sufficient carbon dioxide would also be a limiting factor. The fact is that the air contains only 0.03% of CO2, carbon dioxide, whereas the atmosphere is made up of 78% nitrogen. So look at the difference in the amount that's in the atmosphere. Under high light intensity during the summer, This low level of carbon dioxide in the air, 0.03%, probably is the main limiting factor in photosynthesis and the production of sugars. So here we got a picture of the plant factory, and that's really what it is. So a factory takes in raw materials and assembles it into a product. In this case, we're taking in CO2, water, driven by energy, sunlight, and we make a 6-carbon chain called glucose, and we give off oxygen. So this really is the key to creating a lot of the food and energy on our planet here, is the aspect of what plants do. And so we talked about sunlight can be limiting, carbon dioxide can be limiting, and sometimes water can be limiting. But carbon dioxide often can be the limiting factor in making glucose. Now, glucose is an energy molecule, and really when you look at crop production, you can really say that it's about energy and producing energy. And the more energy you produce, the more glucose you produce and shove in the soil, the better the soil is going to be, the better the microbiome is, the better the nutrition is going to be, the better the plant is going to do. It's going to be healthier. It's going to have a wider, greener leaf to trap more sunlight. And it has the ability to mature properly instead of prematurely dying.
Jim, one thing too, one other thing, the roots actually give off exudates that are basically carbon that feed the whole system. So that's something that the more roots, more plants, the better root system that you have, the more glucose that you're going to give off into that system too to feed the whole system.
That's right. So if crop production is about energy, it's about glucose. And then it's right. The more glucose you can produce on the top, the more you're going to have to shove to the root system. And believe it or not, when you look at this dynamic of this root system, we call it the rhizosphere. This is really the mouth to the plant, and right around here is the stomach. And so the more glucose and energy we can put into that environment, the more we're going to drive the microbes and diversity, the healthier plant we're going to have, the more enzymes that the microbes can produce to create growth and free up nutrients and balance those nutrients, the better the plant's going to do. Now, here's the key. You notice right here, we got CO2 coming off. And we're going to talk about here a little bit later about the fact that as we get more glucose down in there, either from the crop residue cycling into the soil or from the exudates out of the root, the more CO2 is going to come off the soil during the growing season that the plant can trap on the lower side of the leaf. And we have little openings there we call stomata. And when the plant is actively growing, they open up and CO2 goes in. And then, of course, the chlorophyll in the plant is the green portion that traps the sunlight, and the whole thing then creates energy. And so that's really the crust of, when you think about it, it's really crop production, is the development of energy. So the production of an acre of a 200 bushel corn crop requires about 8 tons of CO2. Think about that. 8 tons of CO2. On a still summer day, the CO2 level in the air can drop very, very low, and it can be a limiting factor. When we're under full sunlight, it could be as much as 20 times the normal level that is really required in crop production. So again, CO2 can be the limiting factor as we look at that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is evidence that when we have carbon in the soil from crop residue recycling and sequestering off the top, which we're going to talk a little bit about at the end, and we have CO2 coming in to the profile, then, okay, John, I lost my screen. There we go. The more we have of that and the more diverse our microbes are and the more bioactive carbon we have, the more CO2 that's going to be given off coming up into the air. We call it, a well-fertilized soil-rich soil, decomposing the residue and releasing that as CO2. And so that's a very important process in crop production. Here you see a soil that is well granulated. It's got a lot of bioactive carbon in it. You can see that the corn residue that's there has a lot of fungal activity on it. It's decomposing. That soil there is breathing. It's bringing in nitrogen into the soil. It's bringing in CO2 into the soil. And it's feeding the plant upward. And I remember working with Francis Childs, over a period of time, digging root pits on his farm. I should have put that picture in here of his root pit and the massive roots he had on a 400 bushel corn crop. But I remember being there and having all of this biological activity in the soil, on top of the soil. He even had mushrooms growing there. And one of the keys that he figured out was trapping that CO2, producing a lot of glucose, and driving that up into the plant when we have full sunlight during the growing season. So carbon is needed to enhance soil structure and water holding capacity. Now, the fact is, carbon holds 5 times or more its weight in moisture. The other thing that carbon does, it's a home for the microbes, and it has negative and positive charges that holds nutrients. So it's really critical to having a healthy crop production system when we look at it. And of course, we know that the carbon streams out of the root and also from fungal leakage. And this is kind of interesting when you look at the relationship of microbes in what we call the rhizosphere around that soil, is those microbes are communicating with the plant. The plant is then providing them the things they need for their growth and development. And what they're doing for the plant is producing enzymes then that release nutrients from the soil, balance the nutrients, and produce secondary metabolites that weren't originally there. They also produce a lot of what we call glues or gums or globulin that really help create a really strong soil aggregation that, again, allows for water percolation, but also allow the nitrogen to come in to be fixed by those microbes in the soil that can turn that atmospheric nitrogen into usable amino acids and other nitrogen sources for the plant. So that's a very, very important process and function.
We're missing bioactive carbon in a lot of these soils that have a lot of ponding because they have poor infiltration. So the water just stays on the surface instead of infiltrating or percolating, getting into that soil surface, off the soil surface and into the soil profile. And we're missing bioactive carbon, and that just what you were talking about, the amount of carbon soaks up a lot of that water. So the more carbon we have, the more it'll soak that water up, but the better movement off the surface. And you'll see this, especially in the Red River Valley, these soils are just very low in bioactive carbon. And we see ponding year after year after year when you get a 3-4 inch rain.
And what a difference when you get good biodiversity and good bioactive carbon in the soil, what that means for drainage and nitrogen fixation. And, it says right here, you rarely see a nitrogen deficient plant in a healthy natural ecosystem of the soil. And Dennis and I know that by applying anhydrous ammonia on high levels of nitrogen, that really, along with tillage, really burns out the carbon out of the soil. And if you maintain that biologically active, high-rich carbon soil, you can dramatically reduce your nitrogen application, can't you?
Absolutely.
So,
because the microbes are going to produce that nitrogen.
Right. And what happens is we actually take that nitrogen out of the air and convert that to amino acids. and also incorporate that into humic polymers that are more stable and will not leach or volatilize. And so that's very, very important. And again, this is the power of proper functioning of soil and to have a really wholesome and healthy production system. Now, this slide I put together, and this is really kind of interesting. And when I show this to people, a lot of people don't really believe it when we talk about what it takes to produce. You know, in this case, we're talking about a good corn crop here, 400 bushels. So what would it take to produce 400 bushels? Well, it's going to take about 38 million kernels of corn. And when we look at the ingredients and the components necessary to achieve this high yield, it really comes down to the ears per acre, the rows per ear, the kernels per row, and the size of the kernels produced. In other words, the test weight. And we start out early at about, you know, in the growth of the corn, about V4 to V5, we determine girth. And then at V10, we start determining length. And then, you know, when we start tasseling, we start looking at ear fill or kernel fill. And so, you know, what's going to give us better kernel fill and maintain the number of kernels we got established early? Is it going to be a corn plant that stays greener throughout the growing season into harvest, or one that prematurely dies at the end of the August? So we're going to talk about that. But understand this. It takes about 1,300 semi-loads of air to build 1 bushel of carbon, okay? One bushel, it takes 1,300 semi-loads of air. You convert that into glucose, it takes 100 pounds of glucose to produce 1 bushel of corn. So, you know, don't tell me that crop production isn't about energy. Because if you don't have the energy, you can have the nutrients there and you not get the yield. So they all have to work together. It takes about 5,000 gallons of water per bushel. Think about that. 5,000 gallons of water. But if your soils are balanced and you got good biodiversity, good bioactive carbon, you can drop that down to 3,500 or maybe even a little lower because you're going to be a more efficient plant. It shows you need about 1,100 pounds of total nutrients, NPK, and calcium and sulfur. Look at the amount of nutrients that's left in the residue. 33% of the nitrogen, 42% of the potassium, the phosphorus, 80% of the potassium, 90% of the calcium, and 56% of the sulfur. So let me ask you this question. If you got residue laying on your soil surface that's been there for 2 or 3 years, and you got all that nutrient laying there, are you utilizing that? Are you capitalizing on that? No, you're not. You got a resource there that's unbelievable. So as we get into the end of the program, Dennis and I are going to talk about residue recycling. And that's very important if you want to be a low-cost producer. Look at the amount of nutrients, but not only that, look at the amount of carbon that is there as we look at that. On soybeans, if we're looking at a 100 bushel soybean crop, you have to produce about 15 million seeds, and it's the number of plants per acre, nodes per plant, because nodes hold pods, number of pods per plant, and the size of the bean in the pod. It takes, believe it or not, 4,000 semi-loads of air to build 1 bushel of soybeans, or about 300 pounds of glucose per bushel. Now, if you've never heard this, you're probably saying, oh, that's impossible, but that's true. It takes about 13,500 gallons of water, over twice as much as corn. Why? Because in the carbon need, in the water need, in the nutrient need, we're building a higher energy, nutrient dense product with oils and proteins in it. You can see it takes, you know, about the same amount of nutrients as a corn plant does at 400 bushel. But look at the amount of, again, nutrients, 24% of the nitrogen, 29% of the phosphorus, 41% of the potassium, 88% of the calcium, and 56% of the sulfur stays in the residue. So again, it's tying up a lot of resources. So let's get into why so much of our corn crop is dying prematurely every year. And it seems like it's getting worse and worse. The end of August, first part of September, we see stalk rot is triggered. And premature death of the corn starts from the bottom up and the top down. And it's really across, really when you look at it, about 95% of our acres are dead prematurely. And this is because the crop is running out of energy to fully complete its life cycle. So it prematurely dies. When that happens, guess what? We reduce the ability to fill that kernel, and the density of that kernel is circumvented because we shut off the phloem that moves nutrients up and down in the plant. And yield and quality is left behind. This is really what your corn crop should look like at harvest. We call it the stay green effect. This is a corn crop that has good energy in it. I mean, a lot of energy. It's got good nutritional balance. It's probably got biodiversity in the soil. It's got a lot of carbon down there to work off of, a lot of energy, and that's feeding up during the growing season. This is actually my corn crop back about 12 years ago. It was actually a field I took a picture of. And you see that we have a big old ear hanging here with a high test weight ear on it, a kernel on it, kernels and ear on it, and a dry husk. Now, Dennis, what is the advantage of having a green stalk at harvest?
You have the energy to fill that ear and to continue filling that ear. If you have a brown plant that, like you said, prematurely died, you're not going to have the test weight. You're not going to have the kernel depth. Also, in drying, the more healthy that plant is, the more it can naturally dry down, and the quicker it can dry down.
What is the other advantage of having the stalk green at harvest?
Oh, it'll break down quicker.
Does it have a lot of sugar in it?
Yeah, there's a lot more sugar in it, so the microbes will break it down much faster after you harvest.
And that will actually pump down into the soil again, building that whole soil energy sink that we have down there that's going to feed the plant in the coming season, but it's going to feed the micro all winter long. Yep. And so this is really important. And I don't hear anybody talking about carbon being the limiting nutrient and energy in crop production. So you're going to hear us talk more and more about this. But Dennis, we see a lot of what we call stalk rot type diseases that come in every year in North America. And not only the stalk rots, you know, you have the different diseases, anthracnose, gibberella, you have fusarium, you have Gauss's wilt, which is not necessarily a stalk rot, but it's a disease. And in the corn is just prematurely dying. And Dennis, in your career, have you seen this getting worse and worse?
Oh yeah, big time. What did it start in maybe 2009, I think it was really starting to get bad, and then it's just progressed. Every year you see it, probably beginning early to mid-August, depending on what type of year we had. But it seems like it's always triggered by stress. When you have a drought, you have a hot, dry stretch, maybe a couple weeks, that just triggers the stalk rot, whether it be Gauss's wilt or whatever fungus species that you have going. Gauss's wilt's bacteria, but whatever, if you have the other stalk rots are all fungal species, whatever you have attacking that plant, and it could be multiple things, but you see it every year. And that's one of the things that are shutting our plants down, because they just don't have that channel of nutrients going up and down that plant, because of the stalk rot. Just, it wilts things away and breaks down that inner cellulose and that inner stalk, and you don't have the nutrition going up and down the plant. So usually the top part of the plant will start to die off, or the bottom part of the plant will start to die off, and then they'll just kind of work together until the plant dies.
Now, you know, when we look at it, it really isn't because there's not enough nutrients there. It's there because there's not enough energy. And
Right.
when the plant starts running out of energy, then it starts collapsing. You know, you take a runner that runs a marathon. At the end of the marathon, I mean, he's out of energy. and, and if he doesn't have enough energy to finish the race, he's going to sit down and that'll be it. And that's kind of what happens to our corn crop. And a lot of it has to go back to that energy and that carbon in the soil that drives everything. And so that's why nutrient crop residue cycling, but also having a healthy plant that can produce this glucose and shove it down is so critical, because once this starts happening, the plant just is done and you're leaving yield behind, many bushels behind. You've already spent the money on the herbicide, the fertilizer, the planting, the taxes, and all the other expenses you have, but you're cutting your revenue short because of this. And so when we look at this, it really is the reason why sometimes we just see crop lodging also and loss from that and ears laying on the ground. But the other thing that happens that is really detrimental is usually you have a lot of mycotoxins and aflatoxins that move in on that plant and in that grain. And this is a major problem with livestock. And so another reason why you don't want your corn to prematurely die is because you're cutting off the nutrient value in that grain, but you're also loading it up with mycotoxins that are not going to be good to feed your animals. So that's really something that we need to look at. Now, the other thing we see when we have a lack of proper nutrients and energy is not only do we see the disease, but we see the insects attacking. And, you know, so I'm going to tell you a little bit of my theory on life. There is a divine creation. There is a divine design. There is a divine intelligence and a divine order. And you either work within that or you're not going to be completely successful. And that's what's kind of happened in industrial agriculture. You have to come to the end of yourself and understand that nature really is in control. And once you do that and understands how the natural processes work, you're going to be a lot more successful. You're going to be a stay green grower. You're going to be a low-cost producer grower. Because in nature, anything that is of low energy and nutrition is not worthy of reproducing or eating. And so the creator designed disease and insects to take that out. Man came along and said, I know better, so I'm going to invent insecticides and fungicides and treat the crops so we can keep it live long enough to harvest it. And then we'll feed it to our livestock and we'll eat it. And then we wonder why we have the health issues we do. Really, when you look at it, diseases and insects are nature's garbage collectors. That's really what they are. They're taking out what is not worthy of reproducing. Now, this is a very important statement about energy. You need to remember this. Energy is the amount of ordering which exists at any given point in time or space. So think about that. Energy is required to maintain order within our ecology in the universe. This definition fits agriculture very well, for crop health correlates to order, whereas weeds, disease, and insects and nematodes correlates to soil and plant disorder. So now we're back to energy creating order and getting us to where we want to be. So here we've got a stay green grower on his field on the left versus his neighbors on the right. So what's causing the premature death of this crop? We've talked about that. You see the soybeans on the bottom are a stay green soybean grower, and the ones on the top are a premature death grower. And again, it's just showing you the difference in potential with the same genetics and the same variety in a field. One that is managed properly that creates an energy to drive that plant all the way through to maturity naturally. So This is a refractometer. I have one right here in my hand, a refractometer. And you can also get a digital refractometer. And what you need to do on your crop, and we're going to talk about BRIC here in a minute, but a refractometer gives you a reading from 0 to 32. This is the most, I guess, direct way to measure your health of your crop all the way through the growing season for very little expense. You can control it. Takes you 5 minutes to get out of your pickup. Take the garlic press I got in my hand. You put the crop leaf in there, alfalfa, soybeans, corn, wheat. You take that and you lift the lid, squeeze the juice onto the refractometer, close the lid, look into it, and it'll give you a scale that you can look at from 0 to 30. Now, anything below 12 indicates a lack of nutrition and energy within the plant environment in the sac. And this can be caused by stress, but usually it's caused by lack of energy and low fertility. So we call that a low BRIC plant, a very low energy plant. Anything above 12 is indicated a good plant health. So when we look into this, you see the one on the left here, a BRIC of 5. This plant is going to be attacked by insects and diseases like you wouldn't believe. It's probably going to prematurely die. This one over on the right showing a BRIC level of 14. And this is what you see when you look through the refractometer on the manual one. On the visual one, on the digital one, it'll actually give you a reading. And we can provide these to you. If you call us, we can get these for you. You can go on the internet. You can buy these also. They're available. Every grower should have one of these. It's such a neat tool. And it tells you where you are in your crop at any given time. Now, when we look at this, when we have a higher BRIC, that means we have more sugar, more energy, more mineral, more vitamin, more protein, more secondary metabolites, a greater specific gravity and density. This adds a sweet taste to that food, but it also stores better. You can take a 8 BRIC tomato and a 14 BRIC tomato and put it on your kitchen shelf in the summer, and in a matter of 5 days, that low BRIC tomato is rotting. The high BRIC tomato will not rot, it'll dehydrate. Same thing with your corn in the bin or many of your forages. So when we have a high BRIC, we have more alcohol from fermentation of the sugars, and that helps, of course, is a resistant to the insects and decreases their attack of the plant.
Plus, you have less disease.
Less disease, right, Dennis? And also, the plant will have a lower freezing point. It's not as prone to frost. And also, it indicates that you have better soil fertility. Now, here's a chart that Dennis and I created. And I think this is one of the best charts we got in the whole system because it just lays out everything right in front of you. And you can't argue with this. So over here we have on the left, we have the BRIC scale of 0 to 32. On the bottom, we have the crop quality or value, nutrient density, energy density. And over here in the low end, we're 0 to 8. So when we're below 8, that means we have low quality, lack of balanced nutrients in the plant, low energy, insect and disease attack. You're going to have a lot of weed pressures. Now, Dennis, over the last 10 years, when you went out, in the end of June, 1st of July, and measured your fields across the Midwest, where do you find most of corn soybean fields?
I think you're lucky if you hit 8.
Yeah.
I very rarely see anything above 10. And it seems like they keep going down and down every year. We just don't have the energy in our soils, and we don't have the carbon in our soils anymore. And I think the GMO point or two lower. So
GMOs 1 or 2 points lower, right? So anything down here is garbage, guys. anything that's prematurely dying is in this field right down in here. So about 95% of our crop is down in here. And that's what we're feeding our livestock and eating. Now, the problem with agriculture, we get paid for mass, not for energy or nutrition. So then we got to supplement all this stuff to try to get the pigs out the end of the barn. And now when you get up over 12, now you're getting into quality. You get up in here, 18, 16, 18, you get energy coming up here. You get up here, oh man, that is good food. That has taste, flavor, nutrient density. It's wonderful, okay? Now, the plant can produce thousands of secondary metabolites, and we got it all mapped out. But you've got to be up here to get those put into the food. If you're down here in the bottom, it doesn't happen. And it's all the secondary metabolites that are in this, like the essential oils that create health in the food for us. So you want to be 12 or higher on average during your cropping season on the farm. Now you get up into here above 16 or 12, believe it or not, insects won't go in the field because they sense through visualization or energy that crop is healthy. And that's not their mandate to attack that crop. And it's going to, again, you're going to have more energy and nutrition starting in this food down here, less weeds, disease, and insects as you move up here. If you're running, a cattle, a dairy, you want to have high energy. You've got to be up in here on your forages and on your silage corn. So when you look at it, energy improves as you go this way. It decreases as you go this way. Weeds and insect disease pressure is high at the bottom here and gets less as we go this way. Now, Dennis, I can't think of anything more simple that's more visual than that right there. That really is what you need to know in crop production to really manage it and to measure it, right?
Right, it's very true. And then towards the lower part of the scale, towards the low and the zero, you have much more disorder versus the high part of the scale, you have more order. And it goes back to energy. It goes back to less diseases, less insects at the higher energy level, higher test weight, more nutrition in the grain. Like you said, it'll feed better. So many more benefits, better shelf life. They'll stay in, the grain wise, it'll stay in the bin much better than something that's much lower in test weight and lower. And so there's so many benefits. Plus, when you have a plant that's producing, say even 15, 16 bricks, that plant's going to produce so much more sugars, exudates out the root system.
Right. And
feed the whole biological process versus a plant that's, 8.
You just gave me an idea, Dennis. I want to put another line on here, and it's going to be order. And you go low, you got less order. You go high, you got more order. And more order is better because you have a healthier, more productive plant. I use this chart when I talk to dairy producers, and what I'll do to get introduced, into a large dairy, to get their attention, is I'll ask them one simple question: what's the greatest expense on your farm? And they'll say feed. And I say, okay, what is the efficiency of that feed and the amount of energy and nutrition that cow will extract out of that feed you give her in 30 hours from mouth to tail? And a lot of people won't know, but it's about 45 to 48%. It's not real good. And I'll say to them, if I can increase that 5 to 15%, what would that do for your business? And they light up, and that would be good. And then I go about telling them how to do that. How do you raise that kind of silage and earlage and forage? And then I talk about fermenting that high moisture feed and getting the microbes in there and breaking it down into smaller energy and nutrient bites and getting rid of all the aflatoxins in there. So when the cow eats it, she doesn't have to work as hard, and she's getting more energy and nutrition out of it. She doesn't have to eat as much, so their energy bill goes down. She milks more. She produces more protein, more fat. And you get better somatic cell count, you get less mastitis, and guess what? The calf comes out of her healthy, and she produces more colostrum in the milk and gets the plant of the calf off to a good start. And then we biologically treat that manure, and it goes around into the soil to start all over again to make it better. And we talk about how you build that soil health. And so it's a circle, and every point is connected to the other. So that's how it really, works in reality. So it's really, we call it the stay green effect, building energy. And that's very, very important. And so when we see a decline in carbon, we usually see exit at tillage. We see changing from perennials to annuals, lack of proper crop rotation, increased mineralization of the organic matter due to high nitrogen applications, which actually burns out. There's been a lot of studies over the years, and it'll impact the drainage of that soil also. So the best and fastest way to build bioactive carbon and energy reserves are healthy staging crops that produce a lot of glucose. And as we said earlier, through photosynthesis, this glucose, about 40% of it is exudated in the soil to build soil, to help with nitrogen fixation, to feed the microbes so they can do all the things they need to do for the plant to be healthy. The other thing we need to learn how to do is manage the crop residue that's there after every harvest. Really, really important. And we put a major emphasis on that this fall. And it's something everybody should look at and consider. If we look at residue management by the numbers, 4 tons of residue per acre left behind on a 180 bushel corn crop. So 4 tons plus 2.5 tons, 2.1 tons in the soil, in the root mass. Leaves behind, as we showed you earlier, about 80 pounds of nitrogen, 30 of phosphorus, 190 pounds of potassium, plus all the, the calcium, magnesium, sulfur, etc. That's there. So that residue has a lot of value to it that you need to recycle and take advantage of. And of course, we have all the carbon that's been energy trapped in there also. So what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to export that into the soil and trap it instead of laying it on the soil surface and feed the soil food web and do all the things we want to with the soil as far as drainage, etc. We also want to reduce the mycotoxins that are in there, the diseases and insects that are in there. So really, remember when that residue, especially on this prematurely dying corn, all those diseases and insects are left there to lay in there for the next crop to deal with. And we learned earlier that, in this kind of situation, this can be very detrimental and it can affect the yield, the grain quality, and profitability of the next crop. And so what we want to be able to do with this residue is we want to be able to look at cycling it and getting it broken down. So we're going to, number one, bring the energy, the carbon down into the profile. We're going to sequester it. We're going to bring the nutrients that are in there with it. We're going to get rid of the disease and insects that are in that residue, because we're going to apply a microbial culture and other materials that will digest and sequester that residue down in the soil. Now, what that's also going to do then, it's going to create a better soil seed bed for the planter or drill to run. So we're not going to have interference of that residue with the planter running uneven or hairpinning the residue, wicking moisture out of the seed zone, because that residue is going to be gone or going to be more fragile. So you're going to get a better soil seed contact, a better planting depth, a better uniformity of stand. And there's not a meeting I don't go to in the winter where they're talking about how do we get stand uniformity. Very, very critical. I know, Dennis, you talk about that all the time in the summer when you're out in the field with the growers, and what you see is that stand is so important, isn't it?
Absolutely. So it's probably the number one thing that we try to correct right off the bat, because everybody has planter issues. And one of my guys, Bill, he really went and took heart to that and went to the precision planting system, and now he's got a very good stand, and it made a big difference in yield this year.
The other thing, by sequestering that carbon and getting it pulled down in, you've got an option now to do strip till or no till, where you never had before. And yep. What is that going to do? That's going to reduce the amount of disturbance you have in your soil. You're going to be able to leave that soil food web intact and all the mycorrhizae fungi and all the earthworm channels. And you're just going to have better drainage, aeration, more nitrogen fixation. The soil is going to be living. But if you rip that apart every year, you're going to burn out that carbon, and you're going to spend all that money in tillage. Now, there were in the September issue of Farm Journal, there was a grower, Rick, what was his name? Rick something. He's farms about 7,000 acres, and it talked about how he's reduced his nitrogen, his fertility through crop rotation, cover crops, and he's saving close to $700,000 a year by dramatically reducing his tillage. He's cut his fuel bill in half. And all that money, he's a low-cost producer. All that money's going in his pocket. He's learned how to do it. And so this fall residue program, or managing this residue and getting it properly broken down by putting a combination of the right type of materials and the type of microbes out there in the fall or early in the spring to get that residue pulled down into the profile is something that I think is the most important thing we can do in crop production. Now, consider this. If you build 1% organic matter, bioactive carbon, you're going to be able to hold another 10,000 gallons of water per acre. Your microbes are 70% water. That's going to help through a drought. And look at the amount of more nutrients you're going to hold per acre. Another 1,000 pounds of N, 650 pounds of P, 115 of K, and 700 pounds of calcium. And you're going to retain a heck of a lot more energy. So I hope this is starting to make sense to you. Here's a field where we put out the residue digester on the right and nothing on the left. And look at the difference in the growth of that crop. Now, I'm going to tell you one other thing that this residue does. When you go out and spray your herbicide across those fields, where you have a lot of residue, that's going to keep your herbicide from reaching the soil where the weeds are, and it's also going to soak up the herbicide. So it has a dramatic effect on weed control. Yep. Now, the picture on the right of the residue on the bottom of the picture shows a lot of fungal activity and a lot of residue breakdown versus the one on the left. The one on the right has had our biological program for residue digestion on it, and the other one is the control. So you can see the difference there, and it is dramatic. Now, this particular picture right here shows the effect of plant diversity, building microbial diversity. On the top three lines, what we're doing is we're looking at crop rotation. So the very top line, and of course over here on the left is soil organic matter, percent organic matter. And on the bottom is years in these systems. So the top three lines, so the first line at the top, which is the best one, shows corn, oats, hay rotation. The second line with the square pegs is a corn oat rotation, corn soybean rotation. And the bottom one is a continuous corn rotation. So you can see the bottom one here where we had continuous corn, we're losing organic matter. Where we had a proper crop rotation, we're maintaining organic matter. Now the bottom one is showing in the bottom four where we had wheat, 6 tons of manure. The next one is corn with 6 tons of manure. The next one is wheat, continuous wheat, and the very bottom one is continuous corn. So you see in a continuous corn rotation, you really have trouble keeping that organic matter built up in the soil. And I think a lot of that has to do with you just don't have the biodiversity. Because if you don't have plant diversity, you can have biodiversity. It's plant diversity that brings biodiversity. Now we can put microbial cultures there that'll help that each season, and that's what we do and provide. But you can see the advantages here that crop rotation and also the addition of livestock manure can have to maintaining that organic matter out there in that field. So what we could do is come in with a multi-species biological product with 25 or more microbes in it. And that can be used in the fall in the residue program to enhance carbon sequestration. And also we can use at planting time or during the growing season. And that's going to help also then with infiltration of water and nitrogen fixation. And we use that in conjunction with the residue program as dynamite. I tell you what, I've seen fields this fall that have this program that are green the end of September when everything else around the neighborhood is dying. Now here's another one. You're not going to be able to really see this one, but I'll kind of explain it to you. So the top one, the chart, is a use of one of our biologicals we call 401. Okay, and this is using the Sylvania test that you can have done at a lab like Midwest Labs. And so the red portion in this, it talks about the CO2 burst. The CO2 burst is a very good indicator of soil health. The test measures the amount of CO2 naturally released from the soil due to the activity of soil microbes through microbial respiration. In other words, they release CO2 as they respire and burn up the residue in the soil, and that comes up, the plant collects it. The quantity of CO2 which the crop compares to the crop take up compares to the amount of CO2 the soil releases. Okay, so we're not reliant just on the atmospheric nitrogen, but we're releasing it from the soil. Now, in what that shows on the top one there, the 401, and we'll use 401 in the starter, or we can use it as a pre-emergent after planting. The Sylvania test there showed that the CO2 burst was 39.8 in the untreated area, and the green one below that was 90.2. So it was over 2 times as much CO2 being released by using the 401 on the crop residue. Now the bottom one, the other number there is the soil health calculation. And this is all on this test that you can have done. The use of CO2 burst, the organic carbon, the organic nitrogen, and the CN, carbon to nitrogen ratio, to generate soil health number. So that's what goes into it. The CO2 burst, the organic carbon, and organic nitrogen, and the carbon nitrogen ratio. This calculation looks at the balance of soil carbon, nitrogen, and their relationship to microbial activity. This number represents the overall health of the soil. So on the control on the top one, we had a number, the calculation is 4.2. On the bottom green one, with the treated with the 401, it had 9.3. So again, we more than doubled it. So that's what these microbial formulations can do. Now, with using 501, which is the bottom one, this is what we'd use in fall residue digestion. The top one had a CO2 burst of 62, and the bottom one where we treated was 98. Think about that. Again, a higher number. The soil health calculation was 6.6, and the treated on the control and treated had 11.2. So you can see the effect that these microbial formulations can have on the activity of that energy and that carbon in the soil. I believe the next one shows tillage effect. Reduce or eliminate tillage in your crop production cycle. The following graph shows the impact of different types of tillage on CO2 or carbon and essentially energy loss from the soil. So the one on the left shows 5 hours after these different tillage operations. So you probably can't read that in the bottom, so I'm going to explain it to you. So we're measuring carbon release, and the higher the bar, the more carbon release. So the one on the left on the first bar at 5 hours is moldboard plowing. Second one is subsurface shank, and then mole knife, fertilizer knife, fluted coulter. In other words, only surface tillage, and then no-till. So you can see the major difference between no-till, where we had moldboard plow is 60 versus no-till being 1.4 on amount of carbon released. After 24 hours, the moldboard plow went to 160 and the no-till is 7.2. So you can see the impact that tillage has on keeping the carbon and energy in the soil. What other, the other aspect of that is it's costing you energy to do all that tillage. So if you really look at this in perspective, by being a state green grower and managing your carbon and your energy and doing carbon sequestration in the fall and reducing your tillage, you're reducing equipment wear, labor, fuel cost, you're getting a better soil seed contact with the planter. I'm having trouble trying to understand what about this doesn't work. So what's that?
The erosion, the moldboard plow is going to, you're going to have so much more erosion, wind and water erosion for sure.
And even the broad tillage, you're going to have that, and so a lot of people have not been able to go to no-till because their soil structure hasn't been right. And the residue is a problem because when they go to plant next spring. So treat in the fall with our residue program and take it out and do all the good things you need to do. And you can get to where you want to be and be a low-cost producer, and you can control. It's really about controlling the controllables. There's a lot of things we can control, but if you go to your local retail dealer, they're not going to tell you any of this stuff. And how do they make their money? When they hire a salesman, an agronomic salesman, and they bring him in the first day, they point to the big building they got in the back with all the high salt fertilizer, and then over where the anhydrous tanks are. And then they take them into the warehouse and show them the insecticides and fungicides of all the stuff they got back there. And they tell him or her, this is your job to get this out of the warehouse. This is what you're selling. And the more you sell, the better we do. That's their job. Think about it. Who's in control? You are. And you need to think about controlling the controllables and take charge. In summary, it's all about CO2 cycling. It's about energy to drive plant growth, stay green, quality, and ROI, return on investment. So this is a product we use called Meltdown. We use that in the fall or spring to break down the residue. It's got like 35 microbes in it. It says right underneath the Meltdown, undigested residue is a physical tie-up of your investment dollars, recycle your nutrients, and turn residue into a valuable resource for your next year's crop. Now, where I've seen this used, it's been unbelievable. It worked. All right. In closing, Dennis, you got any additional comments you want to make?
This is the crop residue digestion is something that we've been looking for a product to do this for how many years, Jim?
Years, yeah.
It's something that is probably one of the most critical things that we are not doing in agriculture. You see, this year I saw soybean diseases like crazy. not just a little bit of white mold, not even just that though. Brown stem rot, I saw pod and stem blight. What's the other one? I can't think of the other one. This was all in the same field, and it affected yield. It definitely did. And those diseases harbor or they overwinter in that corn residue, especially the corn residue. And that corn residue is there for more than 1 year for sure. And it's usually 2, sometimes it's 3. So then that residue is still holding diseases for your second year corn, if you will, or third year corn. So you'd be going, you'd be corn, and you go soybeans, then you go back to corn again. And that going back to corn again, you're going to get more fungal diseases and stalk rots and things like that, because that corn residue still hasn't broken down. And the more traits that we use, the worse things are, because those stalks are just, they're not designed to break down effectively without a residue program.
Yeah.
They're like tree trunks.
So I'm gonna kind of close out here, and what I'm going to tell you is, if you enjoyed this evening and want to learn more, now I got to ask John. Have we got any questions, John?
No questions.
No questions. Okay, so guys, Dennis and I are here to help you in our team. We can help you put this all together. Now, we've talked about just a few of the technologies, natural technologies we have. We have these wonderful microbial formulations. We have a good fertility concepts that we can work with you on. We have UBIO, which is a wonderful biological stimulant. We got a product called C Crop with 90 trace minerals in it. It's a wonderful product, that we can use. We've got chitosan technology. Now, we've talked about this in previous webinars, but this is unbelievable. And this is a way that we can help naturally control insects and diseases and nematodes. And I think we can farm today without using insecticides and fungicides. I really do. I think we've got the tools to do that. We got the know-how. So we can help you identify the issues in your cropping program. We can give you solutions. We've got the toolbox. We can give you a recipe to follow. And then we'll stay with you, and we'll follow through. We'll get the data to prove it to you. And so this is what you have available to you, whether you have just crops or you have crops and livestock both. And it's all about the money and being a low-cost producer, sustainability from year to year, and it's caring for the ecology on the farm. So you got a good ecology to live with, and you feel good about what you're doing. And so when it comes to 2021, let us help you. Put it together and provide you that recipe for success. And we'll be willing to walk your fields with you and look at it, and maybe even, take a shovel out there and look below ground. And, Dennis and I like to do that. Now, to close it out, we also can help you because we have an early order program, early order cash discount program. And Dennis, can you kind of tell us how this works and where we're at right now on the early order cash discount program?
Right now we're at 9% if you prepay by October 31st, so Halloween. And then it drops to 8% and on down from there. But that's a pretty good savings on, to prepay for, put some products on this year's billing and this year's expenses. So it's definitely something to consider.
Yep. And, that's a pretty good savings when you look at 9, it was 10%. Now it's 9, it's going to 8 and then 7. So, these are some really good savings. And we got a lot of guys right now that are getting the biological seed coatings put to bed, or maybe their spring microbial product put to bed. It's a number of things that you can put on that program. And Dennis and I can help you with that again, but it's quite a savings. And we encourage you to think about that. We are going to be having a winter conference. I'm looking like right now it's going to be the second week in February this year. So we'll get information out on that. We're going to be going to a lot of the shows this year that'll actually be there. I know they're going to hold the Iowa Power Show this year, and a number of the pork shows are having their meetings. So we can see you there also. But you're also welcome to come and to Albert Lea at any time and see our display room with all of our technology displayed and a lot of really good educational material. So with that, I want to thank everybody for taking part in our program tonight, and hoping you're having a safe harvest. And hopefully the weather looks like it's going to improve here in the next week, get back up in the 50s and 60s so we can get the rest of the corn out, and that'll be good. The other thing that's good right now is commodity prices are up, and I talked to a forecaster today, said that he's telling his producers to plan on $4.50 corn and $11 beans going in next year. So again, an opportunity to really cash in on it in the coming year by doing some of the things Dennis and I talked to you about tonight. So thank you, God bless you, and have a good evening.